All right, great. Welcome everyone. This is the third of 6 webinars in the second series of these global webinars. And as you know, we are basically trying to analyze the international system of power, broadly conceived, and trying to, in a way, respond to this movement to decolonize the curriculum or democratize knowledge or bring to bear on big issues in world politics of a wider variety of voices, perspectives, and approaches and so on, and different knowledge bases, different knowledge traditions too. And I think the idea behind it is, of course, that we all learn a lot from listening to people from a wide variety of positions, perspectives, methodologies, theories, or political philosophies or whatever, but also different global locations. The hinterland in which we study and are scholars or thinkers or whatever has a big effect on the way in which we think. It helps to shape the environment in which we operate, and it promotes certain kinds of thinking and maybe demotes other kinds of thinking. So it's a very simple concept, really. It is just try to bring together through a series of discussions about the international system of power, a wider variety of voices than we may normally get access to in our usual ways, where we stick into our academic subfields or tribes or particular groupings within disciplines. When we go to big conferences, we tend to have lunch, tea, breakfast, dinner, coffee, etc., with the same people that we sit in panels with. And we do this year after year, and we form this kind of tribal identity. And I think it's all very nice to feel comfortable in those things, but it's also nice to hear what other people have to say about the kind of things that you seem to be preoccupied by yourself. So I've certainly learned a great deal, and we've had very good feedback from members of the audience, as well as speakers on the panel speakers in the series. So I'm really pleased that today we've got 3 brilliant speakers on a really big, significant theme, sort of the global South as an ideational and political agency in the world and world affairs. And we can only dip our toe in a little to that particular field, but we'll get a little start in this particular way. And I'm really glad to say that we've been lucky to get a number of institutions from around the world and in Britain as well to support us in our endeavors. LSE Ideas has been there from the beginning. City International Politics Department, of course, has been very generous financially as well. But we have the University of West London, the INEU group in Brazil, who study the United States, the Center for Hemispheric and US Studies in the University of Havana, the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences, and the Global Partnership Network at Kassel University in Germany as well. So we're really pleased to have them as supporters and promoters of this. And we will look forward to the discussion, but I'm going to hand over now to Juvaria to introduce our panel and our theme today. Juvaria.
Thank you, Inderjeet. So today's session is titled Beyond Eurocentrism, Global South Ideational and Political Agency in World Affairs. We'll talk about how Western core dominance in the fields of politics and international relations has come under increasing scrutiny, but still intellectual production about world politics continues to be highly skewed. So in today's session, we will discuss how perspectives that are central to such political analyses are conceived in the Global South, both within the disciplinary boundaries of politics and IR and beyond them. So for this, we've gathered virtually an impressive group of scholars who I will introduce now. We have with us Dr. Sanaa Alimia. She's a political scientist and her focus is on migration, surveillance, and urbanity. She holds a PhD from SOAS in London and an MSc from the London School of Economics. She's with the Aga Khan University, and prior to joining this institution in London, she held various research and teaching positions in Berlin, Germany, Peshawar in Pakistan, and at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Her current research focuses on surveillance, governance, and migration. She's the author of a forthcoming manuscript, which is called The Afghan Question, which is to be published by the University of Pennsylvania Press later this year. We also have with us Dr. Milinda Banerjee. He's a lecturer in modern history at the University of St. Andrews. He specializes in the history of modern political thought and political theory. He is the program director for the MLit in global social and political thought at this institution. His publications include The Mortal God, Imagining the Sovereign in Colonial India, which is published by the Cambridge University Press in 2018. He's also published 2 other monographs and several articles on the intersections of Indian and global intellectual history and political theory. He's also an associate editor of the Journal of Political Theology, Routledge, and the founding editor of 2 series with De Gruyter, Critical Readings in Global Intellectual History, and also Trans-Regional Practices of Power. Our third speaker today is Professor Alana O'Malley. She is the chair of United Nations Studies in Peace and Justice at Leiden University in the Netherlands. She has a PhD in history from the European University Institute, and her first book, The Diplomacy of Decolonization, America, Britain, and the United Nations During the Congo Crisis, 1960 to 1964, was published in 2018. Currently, she is the principal investigator of a new project, Challenging the Liberal World Order from Within, the Invisible History of the United Nations and the Global South. This is funded by a starting grant awarded by the European Research Council in 2019. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Great, thank you, Juvaria. And so Sanaa, please, you have 20 minutes.
Great, thank you so much. And of course, I must really start by thanking both you, Inderjeet, and also Juvaria and everybody behind the scenes at City University for inviting us here today. I'm very excited to be part of such an interesting series, and congratulations on putting it together. And I'm also really pleased to be meeting Milinda Banerjee and Alana O'malley as well. I'm quite excited. My ears are pricking up at both of your works. So I think this is, I'm hoping it's going to be a great chance just to talk to each other about our works as well. And thank you to everybody who's listening in on our talk as well. It's great to see everyone. So I'm going to be speaking today briefly about Afghanistan and Pakistan, and touching on some of the things that I have been looking at, particularly the issue of borders, migration, mobility and belonging, and using a case to really elucidate what I've been working on through some of my work in Peshawar. And what I'll mostly be talking to you about today is from my work that I've done in around about 2015, 2016, and stopped in 2018. I was due to be back there, but of course, because of the pandemic and because of other circumstances, I haven't been back, but I am awaiting, like many of us are, who are kind of divided across borders with families in different places, to be back there soon. So I hope that will happen soon. But so that's really what I'll be speaking about a little bit on Peshawar and the Afghanistan-Pakistan border regions. And as you'll see when I'm speaking today, both the temporal scope of what I'm speaking about, as well as the geographic location, may change. And that is in part to do with the nature of the subject and of the peoples of who I'm working with. And it's also in part to do with one of the things that I want to talk about today, which is, of course, and what I feel all of us want to speak about today, is how the past continues to shape and affect the present, which also therefore challenges our understandings and notions of how we understand time and temporality. And of course, this week, the elephant in the room when we speak about decolonization and the past and the present, of course, has been events that are taking space outside of perhaps the areas of which we are going to focus on today, of South Asia and the United Nations and the broader kind of discussion around that. But of course, given how we see the effects of what's been happening in Israel and Palestine, and the effects of colonialism certainly not being in the past, it's a timely topic, but also a poignant reminder of quite, the legacies that continue on to shape and affect the worlds in which we are living in. What I will be speaking about, of course, is Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the northern parts of Pakistan more specifically, and the areas that were previously known as the tribal areas, or parts of the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa area, which is home to predominantly Pashtun populations. And what I want to do is really to tell a story about how global wars have affected the region and have shaped the region, and how they have been affected by the past. And what I want to do as I'm telling this story, and how I'm trying to, in my work, understand how global politics plays out and how international relations plays out, is that the centering of the subjects who I conduct my research with are not necessarily international institutions or political thinkers or interstate actors per se. It's looking at the people on the ground. This is, in effect, a people's history of how global wars are lived and experienced in day-to-day life. And most of my work has been situated between two big wars in the most recent years that has shaped Afghanistan and parts of Pakistan. And that, of course, is the 1970s, 1980s Soviet-Afghan war in the height of the Cold War, as well as then later on in the 2000s with the War on Terror. Both of these wars, of course, have been punctuated by interim periods, one of which was during the 1990s, when you see a withdrawal of superpowers from this part of the world, when the US thought that they had the job done and the Soviet Union had been defeated, they withdraw from the region. But that doesn't mean that regional politics don't continue to play out and affect those who are living in the region. And at the current moment, we are, of course, at a juncture where the US has announced a withdrawal from Afghanistan. In April, US President announced a withdrawal from the quote-unquote forever war of Afghanistan. And whilst it's very likely that a US presence, particularly through the neoliberal apparatus of privatized security regimes, will continue to have an effect in Afghanistan, where various companies and corporations will be competing for contracts. I'm sure they have done so already. There is a change that is taking place, and many people, of course, are waiting with a bated breath as to what that change will look like on the ground. Just 2 weeks prior to our discussion that we're having today, of course, the Hazara community, a minority community in Afghanistan, and in the city of Kabul, a school of young children, of young women and young girls even, was bombed with 60 young girls losing their lives and over 150 persons injured. And what happens next, of course, is a question that is really shaping and affecting people's lives in Afghanistan and also in neighboring Pakistan, which has since the 1970s been home to the largest Afghan refugee population, largest Afghan refugee population, one of the largest host states of refugees. At its peak, it's estimated that there were 8 million Afghans living in Pakistan. Today, that figure is around about 3 million, and that's 1.5 who are around registered refugees and others who would be considered quote unquote undocumented migrants. So it's a significant impact that we're waiting to see what's going to happen on the ground. But these two questions of trying to understand how it is that global wars affect and impact people on day-to-day lives, I would say they pose both a methodological question and they also pose an epistemological question. So they pose a methodological question for us as scholars of international relations and global politics of the how we do our research, who we interact with, who our field subjects are and our research subjects are. And it changes how we interact with the field. And it also changes how we understand international relations and global politics. Epistemologically, it's also asking us to question how and where is knowledge produced and whose knowledge is considered to be the most relevant for us to understand how global politics is taking place and affecting persons on the ground. And I say this, and I kind of preface what I'll speak about a little bit today with these things, because there's huge amounts of literature that are written on this part of the world. But there is such a gap, as the historian Shah Mahmoud Hanifi has pointed out, to the complex natures of the ways in which the colonial pasts inform the present in these parts of the world, because much of the writings that are done on this area are framed and premised through the lens of geopolitics from above. And much of what I would like to talk about today is building on the works of a smaller number of scholars who have really tried to position this part of the world, which is often riddled with tropes, in a more critical way. And here, of course, I'm thinking of the wonderful works by, for those who are interested in this part of the world, Anila Dolatzai, Mediha Tahir, Sadia Tour, Niv Manjandana, who's at Queen Mary's University, Shah Mahmoud Hanifi, Alessandro Monsuti, and so on. So there have been works that are done, but it's surprising that we are still kind of, often when we're talking about Afghanistan and the Pashtun areas, stuck in these kind of colonial tropes that are so familiar, and they continue to shape how it is that we imagine these parts of the world. So what I'd like to do for just the few minutes that I have with you is perhaps to go through a couple of stories with you, really, that are taken from the work from the work that I've done in this part of the world to kind of bring these points a little bit to life, and to look at how it is that these border making processes change, and how it is that these great wars are lived and experienced on the ground. So I'm going to start perhaps with the story of a small refugee camp that's situated in Peshawar on the outskirts of the city. Peshawar is around about a few hours drive away from Kabul, the capital city of Afghanistan. And at its peak, Peshawar had around about 60 to 62 refugee camps in that city, particularly in the 1980s. It was the site of the resistance against the Soviet Union. It was the headquarters of the CIA's agency was held in the main university campus's agricultural department. It was a place where a number of people who we would become familiar with in the post-2001 world often also lived in University Town. Of course, Osama bin Laden was one of those figures, and so was Ayman al-Zawahiri and others. And Peshawar's refugee camps, they're around about 60 to 62 during the Soviet-Afghan war. The number is much less in the current moment, but the refugee camp, one of the sites in which I work, I'm going to call it Rafiullah camp, just for the sake of the conversation. It's had another name. But on the outskirts of this city is this refugee camp, and the land there was allocated to it through a lease that was secured by the government of Pakistan in collaboration with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, who were active in the country since 1979. And it was a private land holding that belonged to a private landlord who agreed to give this land to Afghans who were moving into the country to settle on for a 99-year lease period. But when I had been working there, there were a number of Afghans who were living there who had been born, lived and raised in the country. But when I was working there in the 2000s, mid-2000s, the area was in a somewhat precarious status. The landlord had been demanding his land back from the residents, and concerned with the threats of facing a potential eviction, the head teacher of the school, who was also a community organizer, Rasul Bakhsh, took the landlord to court so that he could try to secure this refugee camp that was home to a few thousand people and was home to the school in which he was leading. And when he took the court case to the local magistrate's office to prove that they had the right to remain there, the court at the time ruled in their favor. But Rasul Bakhsh felt quite worried and quite scared that this might change. So what he would do is he would walk around with the shalwar kameez in his shalwar kameez, in the pocket of his shalwar kameez. He would have the papers from the court rulings to say that the people and the residents of this area had the right to remain there. And he often would feel quite nervous about it, because what had happened is that the landholder had also taken them to court in return and was threatening to take them to court, because he was saying that the people who had been living there were effectively squatting. And in one instance, the landholder actually started to bulldoze some of the walls of the refugee camp down, and also the school down. These were made out of a kacha mud structure. So these were quite well solid places, but he came in with the bulldozer and bulldozed some of the areas down. And in one of the interviews, Rasul Bakhsh, who was at the time kind of sifting through the chalkboards, sifting through the books and the desks and the chairs and the rubble, was telling me about, in the process of recovering from this part of the bulldoze, the area being bulldozed down, was telling me that, and I quote now from him, they turned up early in the morning to break down the walls. The landlord was a big man, and we were trying to fight them off, the residents of the area. But we don't know how long we're going to be able to stay here for. Even though we have the documents and the permission to stay here, we're not sure what we can do. End quote. In many ways, this story is a very localized conflict that's taking place in Peshawar, and is also telling us a story, if not about geopolitics, it's also telling us a story about urbanity and land and how this conflict is playing out. The landlord wanted his area back because he wanted to build a series of apartment blocks. It was a process of capital accumulation for him. But this was also a global and regional conflict that was also being shaped by shifting global and regional patterns of interstate relations. In the 1980s, the landlord dared not to question the government's authority to whether or not this refugee camp should be in this area or not. But by the 2000s, when a discourse of Afghans being quote unquote legitimate refugees or not was quite prevalent within the country, but also at a global level, he felt emboldened to be able to take such steps. In the war on terror, if in the Soviet-Afghan war, Afghans were heroes who were home to refugees to be welcomed in Pakistan as a part of the Mujahideen's contingent of forces that would defeat the quote-unquote Red Menace, by the 2000s, the picture was very different. The war on terror and the shift against political Islamism, of course, had created a different set of circumstances. And for the Pakistani state, the presence of a large and sizable Afghan refugee population was now being considered something a lot more problematic. And throughout the 2000s, what we see is a series of what you can refer to as a hostile environment towards migrants that is taking place within the Pakistan context that is also informed by a broader shifting geopolitical and global understandings of the rights of Afghans as refugees that ties into what has gone before and what is taking place on the ground then. In the Afghan state, of course, at the same time, in the process of neoliberal state building and refugee repatriation, welcoming Afghans back into the country was also an important way of nation state building, as well as an important way of recovery from the war. For the US, it was also an important way, and its allies and NATO allies, to say that the war has been a success. But of course, the ability of people to return has always been difficult. If anybody is following the post-2001 war and current situation in Afghanistan, not everyone has been able to return. And I'm just keeping an eye on time. So if I hope I'll try to just wrap up so that we can hand over. But what I wanted to kind of draw out and tease out here is that the ways in which we see one thing happening here, which is of course that global wars and the shifts impact and affect the people's lives in these areas. But we also see that there's a broader question, an unfinished and unresolved question of border making that is really shaping the Afghanistan and Pakistan question and the tensions that are taking place between these two states. During the Soviet-Afghan war, a blurred Afghan and Pashtun border, with the two terms that were being used coterminous with each other, were often considered to be quite important to enable political actions to take place so that the Soviet-Afghan war could be considered and construed as a success. This fluid border zone that has been constructed as a result of colonial era policies was no longer something to be considered a success in the 2000s. And it is these processes of unfinished colonial border making processes, or rather problematic colonial border making processes, that still continue to affect and shape the lives of people on the ground today. When the British had governed Afghanistan, they had done it through indirect rule. Famously, Afghanistan was never formally colonized. It was always governed through indirect rule. The areas that neighbored British Afghanistan were called the tribal areas, and they were governed by a colonial draconian law called the FCR for short. I'll keep that acronym just for ease of information. And this colonial law basically placed the people who lived on the border with Afghanistan in these tribal areas in a state of exception, par excellence, right? This was a geographic state of exception, and the entire area and region of these people who lived in this region were subject to and could be subject to collective punishment. It was these particular tribal areas that were what I've said have allowed these kind of mobilities and fluid border movements to take place in the first place. These draconian colonial laws were in effect until 2018 and have continued to shape and affect people's lives. Even today, people are still, of course, recovering from these colonial laws, and it will take years to undo the structural violence that has enabled these laws to be there in the first place. Next to these tribal areas, you had what you would call the settled areas, which is today's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, or was previously known as the Northwest Frontier Province. So this layer of three, what I would call Afghanistan, the tribal areas, and then the Pashtun areas of the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and also included parts of Balochistan. This layer of three were really quite significant and important geographies that were home to partly Pashtun populations, but also other populations. Afghanistan, of course, is not a Pashtun, just a Pashtun state. It also has other ethnicities in there. But this construction of a troublesome Pashtun border areas has really shaped and affected how people's lives have been experienced in this region and continue to kind of have an effect today. The tropes that we see from the colonial era still have an important real material impacts on the ways in which people's lives are developed. And whose lives are able to kind of reach fulfillment today as well. And what we see happening in the current moment is because of the political conflicts that taken place in the war on terror, these tropes have been there and prevalent. The war on terror was, for example, fought as a Pashtun/Afghan war. But at the same time, what you have seen the Pakistani state trying to do, for example, is it's tried to make the border clearer. And it's done that in a number of ways. First, it's kind of gotten rid of this FCR laws and it's integrated the tribal areas into the main province, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. The other thing that it's done is trying to perform the border into effect by having a border fence. And then the third thing that it's trying to do is control over populations. Who is able to be in the state or out of the state? And so there is a process where the tropes remain, yet there are attempts to get rid of some of these colonial ghosts in legal and administrative terms, but not necessarily because they want to push for democratic reform for those involved and the lives who are affected by it, but because of either regional pressures or geopolitical pressures or even imperial pressures, one can say. And I'll close just by saying, what is the response by people on the ground? And what is the response of those and the people who I worked with? Those who are living in the refugee camps, those who I've come to know both in Peshawar and outside of it and across Pakistan, but also here where I'm based right now in Germany, and have had the lucky chance of meeting a number of Afghans who I know myself from my time in Pakistan. And the story for them is not necessarily one of border making, but has been one through which people have lived lives alongside each other. When the camp and the walls were, for example, bulldozed down in Rafiullah camp, the camp I've mentioned earlier, it was low-income Afghans and Pakistanis who worked together to reconstruct the kacha walls of that particular area and locality. And when I asked the people who were living in those areas, well, why have you done this? Do you feel, particularly the Pakistanis, do you feel that it's time now for Afghans to go back and asking, very typically political science types of questions? The answer was, bas da insaniyat masla da. This is it. It's just a matter of insaniyat, of humanity, through which the nation state cannot necessarily capture the sentiments and the lived experiences and the vulnerabilities that people feel on the ground. Even here in diaspora, when I meet Afghans who have lived in Pakistan for a number of years, the opinions will be varied depending on class, gender, ethnicity, and the like. But home is often referred to not necessarily as the Afghan nation for those Afghans who have lived in Pakistan, although there is an emotional and clear attachment to an Afghan identity without any doubt. But home is often referred to through the cities through which they have lived, developed, and transformed through a year or, through 30 to 40 years of being in those cities. And when I've asked a number of people, well, where will you go now when you go home and go to visit your family once you get your papers? The answer has often been Peshawar in the cases of the people that I have worked with. And I'll close it and leave it there with this question then from what is happening as these borders are being challenged from below, and how it is that people who have been living alongside with each other recontextualize their lives along lines of what they refer to as insaniyat, and a South Asian, Central Asian insaniyat. So thank you so much, and I hope I haven't run over time. Thank you.
No, that was great. Well done. Thank you very much. So interesting. I'm sure that lots of people will have questions about what you've just said as well, and I know I do. And just by way of that, for the audience, please use the Q&A function to start typing in your questions, and at the end of the 3 presentations, we'll move to to addressing some of your concerns as well. So thank you very much, Sanaa. That was really interesting. I think Milinda, are you on next? Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Inderjeet and Juvaria, both for inviting me. And thank you, Sanaa, for the extremely moving talk. I'm actually currently working on the political thought of Bengali refugees, from the post-partition until today. And the kind of concept genesis that you talked about, I think is really important to think about subaltern actors in the global South as concept makers. And I have the same experience that what you said with concepts like insaniyat, it's very similar in Bengali discourses, Monushatto, and there's a whole lot of internationalist identifications with Palestinians, with Rohingyas, just out of the fact that there is this humanity of the expropriated, people who have lost everything. And I just wanted to say it was really inspiring. I mean, today's talk, it really goes off from a discussion with Inderjeet, where Inderjeet was mentioning about the kind of debates on decolonizing the curriculum, which is happening in international relations and particularly in international thought. Now, I'm by training a historian of global intellectual history, of South Asian intellectual history, and of course we have had very similar debates. And not self-advertised, but I did write a blog post in the Journal of History of Ideas blog on decolonizing intellectual history, what that would imply, and subalternizing intellectual history in the age of the Capitalocene. And I mean, today's intervention is really about plugging in these discussions which are happening within history to what's happening in international relations. And especially what I'm really interested in is producing a genealogy of internationalist thought, which is not about great brown men producing ideas of state and sovereignty and capital and property, which is something we have heard endlessly about, but about subaltern actors, of women, of lower classes, and what are the kind of internationalist dreams which actually wanted to overthrow the state capital nexus? Because as Sanaa said so beautifully, in South Asia, where we are from, in other parts of Africa, the Americas, the kind of hyper-centralized state sovereignty and rule of capital that we see was actually really instantiated and globalized by European colonialism. Let's not try to whitewash this. So any kind, and my argument would be decolonization has been half done. As long as those borders remain in Pakistan, Afghanistan, as long as they remain in India and Bangladesh, as long as they remain in Palestine, as long as they destroy lives, decolonization is really half done. So what is the rest of the work of decolonization? It should be about overthrowing the colonial state sovereignty and the kind of racial capitalism which colonialism globalized. And this was something at the heart of South Asian internationalist thinking. And I want to talk today about some of those issues. But before I start, I wanted to start with biographical vignettes, because the kind of internationalist political discourses, intellectual histories that I'm talking about have very concrete social lives. And for people who originate in the global South, they have very visceral affective registers. And I just wanted to start with with a few biographical vignettes with my grandmother, who was growing up in rural Bengal in the late 1930s, early 40s. She moves to Calcutta for education and becomes embroiled in, she becomes a member of the Revolutionary Socialist Party. So she would read Marxist Capital in reading groups as a teenager girl. And then she took part in 1942 in the Quit India movement to overthrow the British Empire and was practically killed. She wasn't, thankfully. The woman in front of her was killed. She spent a year in prison, and then she became a revolutionary socialist person. And her kind of internationalism was always not about nation state sovereignty and capitalism. As she grew older, in her 80s, she lived up to her mid-90s, she grew very disenchanted with the Indian nationalist politics that's going on today, because this was not the independence that she had dreamed about, she had almost lost her life for. Or let's take somebody like my maternal grandfather, her husband. I mean, a few years later, in the aftermath of the Asian Relations Conference, which we all know about, which is this premier conference of Asian societies, my grandfather wrote a very famous poem on Asia, which was not about the independence of Asian nation states, but about the independence of farmers, of people in agricultural fields across India, in Ceylon, in Indonesia, in Indochina, and so on. I remember hearing stories from my father growing up in the 1960s in a very remote village of southwestern Bengal, of seeing a play on Patrice Lumumba, the great African politician of Congo, martyred at the hands of the Belgians and the Cold War politics. And why did Patrice Lumumba what did internationalist solidarity with Africa mean in the 1960s in the Bengali countryside? That's what I think I'm really interested in, not the kind of high-flowing internationalist discourses of, I mean, I'm not saying that what Jawaharlal Nehru does and Indira Gandhi does is not important. Of course it is important. But in terms of popular social politics, in terms of how people vote, in terms of who they sympathize with, in terms of the rhetoric that goes on in India, in Africa, in the Middle East, and everywhere, we have to understand how people understand internationalism from below. We have to understand subaltern internationalism. We have to decolonize internationalism. Internationalism not as interstate solidarity, but about those oppressed by state and country. Now, going on from this very small spaces of remote Bengal, let's move to another space, Tokyo, between 1946 and 1948. Post-Second World War, the second most famous international trial of the 1940s after the Nuremberg trial, the Tokyo trial, the International Trial Military Tribunal for the Far East. It's convened to try and punish the top Japanese political military leadership. And perhaps the most famous Indian international jurist of the 20th century, Radha Vinod Pal, is there in Tokyo. He writes a very famous dissenting judgment, which is seen as canonical for good and for ill by international criminal lawyers today, because it's seen as a founding moment of anti-colonial perspectives on international criminal law. Because what happens in Tokyo is, of course, the classic problem, nullum crimen nulla poena sine lege, no crime, no punishment without a prior law. So how do you actually justify punishing the Japanese military political leadership of crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, and conventional war crimes? The Allied powers, especially the president of the Australian judge, William Webb, who's a Catholic, and the chief prosecutor, Joseph Keelan, an American Catholic, they use Catholic natural law arguments in order to say that what the Japanese have done is violate these kind of natural law principles. And of course, in the process to legitimate Allied reimposition of colonialism, the reimposition of French colonialism in Indochina, Dutch colonialism in Indonesia, British colonialism in Malaya. All of these are also justified through this trial process. And Radha Vinod Pal writes this extremely important judgment, which has been massively misread over the last few decades. And in several of my publications, I have argued that why it has been misread. It has been misread because people have read it as a defense of state sovereignty, as a defense of positive law against the internationalist, naturalist principles of international criminal law. And I would argue that's a complete misreading. It's a much more difficult judgment. It classically exemplifies what the post-colonial Shuddhita Biraj talks about, using a very Hegelian term from the phenomenology of spirit, the unhappy consciousness. The unhappy consciousness of the colonized, which is neither able to accept the West nor reject the West. In that judgment, there's a very key sentence, which people have often not read at all. And this is, I'm not in love with the idea of national sovereignty. And I think this is a very key sentence. Why does Radha Vinod Pal actually say he's not in love with the idea of national sovereignty? This is a time when India is gaining independence. And it's very clear from the judgment, as well as from other writings, that Radha Vinod Pal is not interested in the idea of the nation state per se. For him, the nation state is a necessary evil. It's a necessary evil which needs to be used as a defensive mechanism for Asian and African societies against the Western imperialist powers, but it is not what they really, really want. What they really want, Radha Vinod Pal says in that judgment, in other writings that he writes as a member of the International Law Commission, of which he's twice the president, as an observer for the Asian African Legal Consultative Committee, which is this pioneering legal body of newly independent Asian and African states. He says, what we really want is a world community, a world communal life. What we want is world peace through world law. But, and this is the very important but, it's not a world law which will be instantiated by the Western powers, by the Soviet powers from above, because look at the hypocrisy of the West, Indonesia, Indochina, Korea. It will be instantiated by decolonizing Asian and African societies, forming new principles of international justice through their democratic planning, through their democratic deliberations. So it's an idea of internationalism which is formed from below. And I would argue that this idea of internationalism from below, and another important thing that Radha Vinod Pal also writes against the kind of racism in the United States, in apartheid South Africa and so on, is he's very concerned about the material dimensions of colonialism. It's about the evils of poverty. It's about the evils of hunger, of people dying of hunger. Again, not something surprising. He's from Bengal, 1943 Bengal famine, millions dead because of Churchill and British policies. So the visceral life of hunger, of poverty, of malnutrition is the instigator behind how he's thinking of internationalism as something which should overthrow the state capital nexus. And he does defend nation state sovereignty, but he does it in a very double move, in a very ironic move, because it's the only defense possible in a Western international system which is dominated by the principle of state sovereignty. But he says very clearly, I'm not in love with the idea of national sovereignty. And my argument is, and this is something which goes against a lot of what current intellectual historians have been writing about, but which I think I'm completely compelled by my sources to say, at the heart of Indian political thinking since the late 19th century was a critique of state sovereignty and a critique of colonial capitalism. This is true even in thinkers we consider as very Hindu nationalist conservative like Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay actually says patriotism, uses the English word, is a sin, uses the Sanskrit Bengali word pap. It's a sin because it has caused the genocide in North America. So even somebody as Hindu conservative as him is critical towards that. If we turn to somebody much more liberal, much more cosmopolitan, like Rabindranath Tagore, I mean, you probably all know his famous lectures on nationalism, which he delivers in the United States and in Japan in 1916 and 17, in the middle of the First World War. They are harangues against nationalism. He says the nation is a machine. The nation is a machine. And this is very important because for Tagore and for many other thinkers, including Gandhi, including many others, what was so exceptional about British imperialism? And Indian thinkers said British Empire is not the same as the Mughal Empire. Because they made the argument the Mughal Empire might have done, a lot of atrocities and so on, but it was still a rule of human beings. And the specific thing about Western imperialism is it's a rule of the machine. So Tagore uses the word Kale Shashon. And in a rule of the machine, you can never have benevolence. A Mughal emperor might do cruelties, but would also be benevolent, would appoint Hindus to high positions and so on. But the rule of the empire, of the British Empire and of other empires, is a rule of the machine. And Tagore's writings are full of correspondences that he establishes in Bengali and in English between the rule in the plantation, the rule in the factory, the rule in the colonial office, and the rule of the state. So the state, he says, is like a factory. And this is, of course, the imperial state he's initially talking about in the 1900s. But by the 1910s, he's convinced that even the nation state, and he especially becomes convinced after visiting Japan, because Japan becomes this double mirror for Indian nationalist thinkers. What Indians aspire to since the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese victory of 1904 and 1905, but what they also fear about. They fear India becoming a Japan, another, a mimesis of the West, a Japan which becomes imperial in its own right. And Rabindranath Tagore is really quite appalled by what he sees in Japan. And then he comes out with these lectures against nationalism, where he says non-Western societies should not become like the nation, because the nation is like a machine. It's basically, I mean, he uses a language without referencing Marx, but it's very clear, it's a very anti-capitalist language. It's a machine which puts human beings to work, which extract value from them, and so on. And of course, we have to understand this in terms of the global movement of racial capitalism, because racial capitalism, as instantiated through slavery, as instantiated through endangered labor, through the experiences of Black and Brown peoples around the world, nation state sovereignty has manifested itself as empire. British nationalism and French nationalism manifests itself in former British and French empires. And it's a machine, as Tagore would say, for extracting surplus value from subject populations. And therefore, the reaction against state sovereignty, including against the nation, as Tagore said, is also a reaction against racial colonial capital. Of course, this also has a very strong gender dimension. So if you look at the endangered labor, many of the most horrifying victims of endangered labor were, of course, women, who not only suffered from economic exploitation, but also, of course, from sexual exploitation. So if you look at somebody like Sarojini Naidu, who is a pioneer internationalist, feminist thinker of the 1910s, and who is really instrumental in women getting limited voting rights by the late 1910s, along with other feminists. She says that the major problem with endangered labor, why it's so dehumanizing, is especially it's so dehumanizing to women. It robs women not only of their labor, but of their dignity. And this is, again, something you see her critique of capital, that colonial capital is also has a very strong gender dimension. It's about the commodification of female bodies. We see this also, I mean, going and, looking at people like Rabindranath Tagore in the United States and Japan, Sarojini Naidu in India and Britain. These are, high-flying figures. But if we shift the scale back again, and I'm really interested in a kind of multi-scalar, trans-scalar work, in constantly shifting scales, if we go now to, again, going back to the Indian countryside, the sub-Himalayan Indian countryside, we see peasants, lower caste peasants, who in the colonial times are called the depressed classes, and today would be known as the scheduled caste or the Dalits. And one of the largest Dalit peasant communities are the Rajbangshis. In the late 1910s, in the context of these British declaration of promising self-governance to Indians, these Rajbangshis, they basically say, we have always traditionally been self-governed by our own councils. Now, you British, they write a letter to the British government, you British, when you are devolving powers to Indians, please don't devolve powers only to the, the high caste Indian elites, devolve powers to the local villages, to a minority and subaltern communities. And we see the use of the language of the minority, the small and the low, devolve power to them. But it's not a purely subalternist language, it's also an internationalist idiom. So the Rajbangshis say, we also want to establish our sympathies and with other similar communities, not only across the British Empire, but across the world. And there is a language of federationism, that we should kind of federate across borders, across the empire, across the world. And this is clearly a kind of peasant agrarian internationalism. Internationalism based on circles of autonomy, going on from the smallest lower caste village across the empire, across the global borders, and about democratic devolution of powers to them, which cannot be fitted very easily into a kind of Congress nationalism kind of understanding. Now, again, if we shift scales again, so if we look now at, I'm thinking again of Sanaa's wonderful, references to Pakistan and Afghanistan. Afghanistan today is seen as a kind of failed state, perhaps. But in the 1910s, that was absolutely not the case. Amanullah wages successfully the Anglo-Afghan War. He makes Afghanistan independent. In the late 1910s, 1920s, Afghanistan is actually a model for Indians, for Hindus as well as Muslims. For people like Qazi Nazrul Islam and so on, Afghanistan is what you aspire to be, this tiny state which has gained its independence against the British. And the Indian Communist Party of India is actually formed in 1920 in Tashkent, in Soviet Turkestan, largely out of Muslim muhajirs who have left India during the Caliphate agitation, who are Muslims, who have gone to Tashkent, as well as more elite people like M.N. Roy and so on. And what we see in the 1920s is a fascinating subaltern Muslim internationalism. And there has been some amazing work on this by Suchetana Chattopadhyay, by Laili Uddin, and so on. Kind of peasants, laborers, coolies, being not talking about pan-Islamism, but not really about the Ottoman sovereignty. Or if they talk about Ottoman sovereignty, it's not just about the Sultan, but it's more messianic, millenarian dreams, the coming of the Mahdi, what this would mean in terms of overthrowing the Hindu landlordism, agrarian rent, as well as colonial revenue systems and so on, which have a very long afterlife. I mean, if you think, for example, of Laili's fantastic work on Maulana Bhasani, you see how this kind of socialist, pan-Islamic, subaltern, Muslim communist internationalism develops, which haunts the Hindu nationalist right today. The Hindu nationalist right today has adopted this French term Islamo-gauchiste and is translated into languages like Bamo-Islamic to precisely because it's mortified of this kind of subaltern Muslim kind of source of socialism. But it's a fascinating kind of internationalist solidarity which is formed, and it remains very important today in Indian kind of subaltern and radical politics. Of course, even when we think of somebody like Jawaharlal Nehru, who one would imagine as the great thinker of the nation state, as late as, if you read his Discovery of India, the edition published in 1946, somebody like Nehru actually has a much more complicated idea of sovereignty and power than just of the nation state. I mean, even in 1946, he's thinking about, in a way very similar to the lower caste Rajbangshi politicians, about circles of governance which go on from the village through the nation, through kind of confederations. He thinks about different kind of Eurasian, Asian confederations, up to the idea of the one world. And we know from Manu Bhagwan's scholarship, of course, the idea of the one world is very important in Indian internationalist thinking, but it's an idea of the one world, in the case of Nehru, very strongly imbued with anti-capitalist thinking. And ultimately, in Nehru's case, at least before he becomes, before India becomes independent, it's also a critique of nation state sovereignty, because I mean, Nehru is interested, at least, in kind of intellectual terms, in different layers of power from the local level to the internationalist level, and not about constricting power to the nation state. I mean, there is much more complexity to his thinking. Now, the obvious question that arises is, what happens to these fascinatingly rich histories post-independence? Is it that India and Pakistan, these two leviathans, and in the Constituent Assembly of India, actually the word leviathan is debated. Hobbes is debated in the Constitution, which I've shown in my book, The Mortal God, because there are people who are thinking that the post-colonial Indian state would become like a leviathan. It would become what they have never wanted India to be. But of course, the Indian and the Pakistani states are both states which do a lot of really sovereign atrocities, ethnic cleansing, and have blood on their hands. So what happens to all these internationalist dreams? Do they disappear? And I would say absolutely not. And there one has to shift the scale again from Delhi or Islamabad to politics in the streets, in the countryside. So think about the late 60s, early 1970s, one of the biggest rebellions the world has ever faced, perhaps in terms of demographic terms, the Naxalite Rebellion. And the Naxalites are, again, I mean, these ultra-left revolutionaries, they are thinking in very, very global terms. They are thinking of establishing a new world, a Notun Dunia, a new man, and so on. And their dream is liberating every village is a dream of liberating the world. And I've written about this, why this is the case, because they think about the world as a kind of space of congealed class relations and class conflict, where India is a puppet of American imperialism as well as of Soviet social imperialism. Against that, the Naxalites extend solidarities with China, with Vietnam, of course, but also with the Latin American states, with Eastern Europe, with Palestine, with African American civil rights movements, and so on. Because the idea is to liberate the smallest village is actually a tool in liberating the world. And liberating the world, getting rid of these imperial hegemons, will not be possible without these small acts of making every village a liberated zone and liberating it from the state, from the moneylenders, from the peasants, and so on. So there is a kind of constitutive bivalence to Naxalite thinking, which is both extremely local and extremely international at the same time. And the Naxalites, of course, continue to be a very powerful force in India today, if you think about the Communist Party of India, Maoists, and so on. If you shift the scale to something else, to Adivasi politics, if you think about the UN conventions on the indigenous peoples, if you think about the ILO 169 about the rights of the indigenous and tribal peoples, that is all used by Adivasi populations in India today. The people of northeastern India, especially of Nagaland and Tripura, have repeatedly referenced these kind of UN conventions to basically position themselves as having a subjectivity in the laws of international law and not to be brutally dominated by the Indian nation state. And that is something where we see, and again, an internationalist dimension to Adivasi thinking. We see it in Dalit politics. Dalit politics is heavily imbued with references and solidarities with the Black African American experience. And the Indian nation state doesn't like it very much, but Dalit politicians would like to say that the atrocities they face, the caste atrocities from high caste Hindus, is very similar to the atrocities faced by Black people from white people in the United States. The Indian state, of course, resists any kind of equivalence between race and caste. But if we look at actual Dalit thinkers, people like Manohar Mauli Biswas, for example, Manohar Mauli Biswas argues that what is common to the experience of Black populations and the experience of lower caste populations is the extraction of surplus value from them. The extraction of surplus value, making labor cheap. And Manohar Mauli Biswas is of refugee background. He grew up in an East Pakistani, East Bengali, lower caste Namo-Shudra family, ships sent to West Bengal. So this is also, of course, refugee proletarianization and refugee internationalism at a very visceral proletarian thinking level. And yeah, I'll just finish in 1 or 2 more minutes. And of course, finally, the last point I want to mention is environmentalist thinking. whether you look at people like Amitav Ghosh or feminists like Kiti Bhattacharya or Mahashita Devi and so on, there's a lot of really fascinating environmentalist thinking coming out of India, which resists capitalist thing-making, and to use Kiti Bhattacharya's work, to produce, to rather emphasize life-making. And this is, again, a globalist thinking, which is super important in the age of the Anthropocene Capitalocene. So I just want to conclude there, just maybe 30 more seconds. The reason Indian thinking has been so internationalist is because of the global dimension of global capitalism. Because of the global nature of global capitalism, the commodification of social relations, the kind of class polarization, and especially the racial capitalism and racial colonialism, which subaltern populations in the non-Western world has faced, changing class relations, changing gender relations, changing race relations in the global South has been inextricably about changing it everywhere else in the world, and especially particularly in other parts of the global South, and establishing the internationalist solidarities in the fight to make for a just and more free world. And I think we need to recuperate these resources today in critical intimacy if we are to build a more just world. Sorry again for slightly jumping over time, but thank you so much again.
No, not at all. I'm sorry I had to intervene a little bit, but that's really interesting. And I've got a few questions I would like to ask, and I'm sure our members of our audience and maybe the panel also would like you to kind of maybe expand on some of that as well. But thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. And I'm glad you can talk fast because you got through quite a massive amount of material in that time, but it's to our advantage. Thank you. I'll move over now to Alana, please. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Inderjeet, and thanks Juvaria as well for organizing this. And good evening to you all, and thank you so much to the speakers, to Sanaa and to Milinda. It's an incredibly hard act to follow, both of you, but I'm going to try and say some things that I think we have in common, and then perhaps also other things that may be a little bit different in my perspective. So I'm just going to share my screen here. So what I wanted to talk to you today about is something quite specific as a way of thinking about a big idea. And so the title of my talk you see there is a little bit about the permanent sovereignty over natural resources, this campaign at the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, and just looking at that campaign as a way to explore the historical sociology of decolonization at the UN. So I'm going to take you through kind of the big project that's kind of in the background of this paper. This is the first effort actually of this new project that Juvaria mentioned, of trying to really put meat on the bones of that idea of thinking about the ways in which global South actors shaped the international order, primarily through the UN. But I wanted to kind of just pick up on two different things that Sanaa and then Milinda talked about. And Sanaa mentioned this whole idea of knowledge production and the importance of global South actors in producing knowledge. And this is exactly what I'm interested in doing. And I thought that it was very relevant, these kind of subaltern stories that you told of refugee populations. And in a way, and this is where my work is perhaps at the other end of what Milinda and Sanaa have been talking about, is I'm really interested in how this is manifested at the UN, right? So how do individual actors from the Global South, primarily state and non-state actors, manage to produce new knowledge about various issues at the UN? And this kind of connects as well with a little bit of what Milinda was talking about, which is this idea that there's a kind of subaltern population of the Global South that are just not reflected in our thinking about IOR and international history. And I should say that I'm very much a historian, so I always welcome these conversations with international relations scholars, and I think that there's so much fertile ground between the two disciplines. And this project is very much an effort to try to make a stab at bringing together those conversations a little bit by producing a new genealogy of the UN that's rooted in international relations, but that's very much a product of history. So I want to first talk a little bit about my kind of big project, right? And this we will talk about how this ECOSOC paper is a way to, if you like, ground out some of those ideas. So if we're, also thinking about the comments of the earlier presenters, what we know about the liberal international order and about the UN is that, firstly, it's not very liberal for most of the people who existed at that time, and also that the histories of these two processes and of the institution is primarily Western. So we always rely on Western sources. We examine the objectives primarily of Western states and certainly Western actors. And so I wanted to get at this problem by thinking about how is it that since 1960, 2/3 of the UN's members are from the Global South, in the sense that they identify with those politics. And we know relatively little about how they have behaved at the UN, what they have changed, what they have not managed to change at all. And so I started thinking about this as a real problem that I wanted to tackle. And so the project then became about, tracing the invisible history between the UN and the Global South. But I don't mean that that history doesn't exist. I simply mean that there has been a process of invisibilization in the historiography, whereby we have rendered the agency of Global South actors as invisible. And so primarily, I want to examine how has the UN both facilitated but also limited their role in global order, and what has been the consequences of this, not just for the issues that they pursue in decolonization, you're talking about sovereignty and self-determination, economic sovereignty, but also human rights, but also what's the consequences for order within the Global South, so between those actors as they mediate their claims in an international environment. And this very much then opens the way towards thinking about precisely those different types of internationalism that we heard from the other two speakers. That is subaltern and non-state activism. That is the internationalism of actors who do not have a state to represent, those nations who are unrepresented, but also those peoples, both in colonial and post-colonial spaces later in the 60s and the 70s, who feel that they are not represented by the state in which they find themselves. So I really want to understand a little bit that black box question of the UN, which is, why do some actors get agency and get voice and get representation, and some actors don't? And what happens to the issues that maybe get to a provincial level or get to a national level or get to a trans-regional level in regional organizations, but don't get inscribed on the UN agenda? And that's pretty much the kind of wide frame that I want to start with, that I think also kind of connects a little bit with the other two papers. So in thinking about this, and as a way to tie it down at a moment when I can't go to the archives thanks to the pandemic, I started to look at the whole process of permanent sovereignty over natural resources. And this really arose from some documents that I had found in the Ghanaian archives, and actually in the George Padmore Library in Accra a couple of years ago. And it was a memo from the Ghanaian delegation to the Law of the Sea conference. And it was the first international engagement that Ghana had as a post-colonial state and as an independent state. And the head of the delegation wrote back to Kwame Nkrumah and said, it's great that we're here, but we really need more time to work in the corridors, because what's happening is that we're spending a lot of time in these official committee meetings and discussions, but we really want to develop social relations with other representatives at the Law of the Sea conference. And they actually emphasized that working in the corridors was equally as important as giving public speeches. So it really confirmed for me the kind of hunch that I had been thinking about when I was working on the Congo crisis, that actually what happens behind the scenes at the UN is as formative as what happens in the public spaces. And so this is really what I'm trying to think of then as the sociological process of institutions, but also in the historical context, the sociology of decolonization. And that really connects as well, I think, with these debates about solidarity, because in certain respects, solidarity is very important in terms of giving actors identity and giving them a sense of collective power, but it also has to have some substantive content. So where are the limits, but also the kind of productive modes of solidarity? Well, they're in those internationalist environments where disparate actors use solidarity to achieve certain purposes. And primarily, my argument here is that this sociological process is a way to shape the normative behavior of actors. And actually that in this case with PSNR, it was Global South agency that shaped the normative behavior of Western actors around the quest for permanent sovereignty over natural resources. So in many ways, I'm sorry for the quality of the photographs. It's very difficult sometimes to use the right images from the UN archives that are the right quality. So these ones didn't turn out as I hoped. But this is an image of the Commission on Human Rights, the ECOSOC Commission on Human Rights in December 1952. And of course, these are the crucial debates when the Convention on Human Rights gets split into two covenants. And when the arguments from the Global South representatives to keep economic and social rights linked with civil and political rights get destroyed really by the United States. And so it's kind of ironic in some ways that the US is given such credit for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because when it came to the covenant, they really wanted to divorce civil and political rights quite strongly from economic and social rights, precisely because of these questions of economic sovereignty that were kind of lurking in the background. And so in then thinking about that process, I wanted to look at the impact of social discourses and what real influence does that have on the content of rights claims around economic questions. And what I found was that the theories from people like Katzenstein, but also other institutionalist thinkers, really were quite formative as an intellectual scaffold to think about the way that sociological institutionalism worked in practice in historical setting at the UN. And that really this had the effect of kind of legitimizing a lot of claims of what economic sovereignty was and how to achieve it that arose from those Global South actors. And so it really kind of emphasized that decolonization was as much a socially driven process as it was a politically driven process that was only about ideology and national interests. So what does permanent sovereignty over natural resources really mean? So we know that it's talking about ownership of natural resources, but it's also about several other important features that I think, again, really were kind of coming out of debates that were taking place at the subnational level among different subaltern actors, among regional collaborators, who were really thinking about the meaning of self-determination in a very expansive sense. And so natural resources is, of course, the first part of this process, but what these actors are also interested in is the regulation of foreign investment, also of private capital, and the regulation of private corporations. And these are the tensions that really run through this whole moment of the agency of Global South countries in trying to shape or reshape the inequity of the international economic order that goes right until the 1980s. And in many cases, these tensions are already evident in the early 1950s. And I've taken this thumbnail image here from a film. So what the UN archive has is that it doesn't have images and pictures of the ECOSOC meetings, but it has the audio of a lot of them. So it's actually an incredibly useful resource. And here is the Uruguayan delegate in the session in 1962. Now, Latin American actors were incredibly influential and important, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Chilean delegation later on, but Uruguay also played a very, very important role in inscribing on the agenda the collective ambitions of Global South actors who were both in 1952, remembering that most of them were still in colonial spaces, who were both representing those disenfranchised peoples, but also seeking a nation by expanding the meaning of self-determination. So this kind of got me thinking then about how did these actors use the UN environment and what was important about that utility? Well, I mean, this kind of gives you an overview of the dates, the progression, the chronology, if you like, of the whole idea of economic sovereignty. But I wanted to, I'm not going to read them all out, but what I wanted to highlight was that we see the whole idea of economic sovereignty just becoming more and more concretized through different committees in the UN. And this is what's really interesting about these actors' use of this international space, is that they're able to make cross references to debates that are simultaneous, but not connected. But they're the ones that are making the connection between the different debates that are going on at the UN, from the Economic and Employment Commission to the second and third committees. And then finally, they get it into the General Assembly proper in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And what they're really talking about is, in all these different spaces, is that economic rights are human rights, and that economic rights are also sovereign rights, and that this is part of the whole conception of self-determination and sovereignty. And it really tries very much to paper over the cracks of what kind of the Western powers' objection, which is that no, sovereignty is territorial, sovereignty is not economic. Now, why is this important? This is a debate and a conversation that we know about sovereignty. Well, somehow in that debate, we've lost the whole emphasis, which is that this is driven by global South actors. Largely, they are Latin American actors in the late 40s and early 50s. But really, already by 1954, right, which is way before the Global South have the majority of the General Assembly, we see Global South members from Africa, Asia, and Latin America working together to establish a kind of voting majority, even in subcommittees of ECOSOC, in order to drive forward these different ideas together. And what they're actually able to do in 1954 is notable, is they're actually able to defeat the Western objections, arising primarily from the UK and the US, really about the whole kind of decoupling of economic sovereignty from broader sovereign claims. So what we see is that actually economic sovereignty is, if you like, a little bit the meat of the substance of a lot of these claims of solidarity that are, in my view, sometimes quite nebulous between different sets of actors. And in fact, what we have is a quite concretized institutionalization of those claims of kind of solidarity and those claims of kind of similar aims. And they really managed to not only move the issue through the relevant parts of the UN, but they also managed to leave a trail of intellectual progression around the idea of self-determination, but also substantive achievement. And eventually, of course, we get the report and the resolution in 1962, which declares permanent sovereignty over natural resources. And that goes on to have kind of quite significant and quite long-lasting effects for the meaning of sovereignty and self-determination, but also for the agency of the Global South. And so this is really, this paper really tries to kind of concretize that agency at a time when we presumed it didn't actually have much effect, by showing that in fact what happens in the 40s and 50s really fundamentally impacts the debates that go on later on about the NIEO and about UNCTAD, and then of course in the 1980s. So what are we kind of left with really? Well, what we can see is that at the end, the UN actually declares that economic sovereignty is a basic constituent of the right of self-determination. So what it means is that political economy and sovereign equality are made one, are made whole at the same time. And this goes not just for the elites and the cartels who have controlled natural resources until this time, you know, from the 17th century onwards, but it also really kind of pushes forward this idea that Global South agency, even when it's not sovereign, can actually challenge the sovereign power of the great powers. Now, there's some tensions that arise from this. I mean, a lot of Global South actors criticize the report of the Permanent Commission because they say it doesn't go far enough, and there's tensions that arise around the rights and duties of states and private corporations regulation that we don't really see happening for several decades later. But I think that this is just a way to kind of show that this genealogy of these ideas is actually rooted in kind of quite institutionalized and organized cooperation, which a little bit goes beyond this kind of sense that they just had some kind of a vague sense of solidarity with each other. And I've highlighted there the Chilean ambassador Hernan Santa Cruz, because he's actually fundamentally important, and Chile plays an incredibly important role in keeping the Commission on track and in auditing and editing that final report. And Chile really is fundamental also in the later debates then, of course, about the NIEO. I also wanted to mention very briefly that, of course, I mean, I'm trying to use the kind of keep my focus on the UN developments, but of course this spreads out. It spreads kind of both to the regional level and to the national and provincial levels, and also back, it flows back from those associations. And there is a kind of a whole organizing machinery that goes on during these years that again kind of institutionalizes that cooperation, provides more space for Global South agency, but also really tries to construct the international order in a quite a concrete sense. Some of them are mentioned there. We already heard a little bit about the importance of the Afro-Asian Legal Consultative Committee, and actually, in fact, they're very important in the writing of that report. But these are lasting institutional frameworks and arrangements that really lay the groundwork for something like UNCTAD and INEU later. And they really create a kind of a sense of ownership for those Global South countries of the UN environment, but also a replication of some of those UN instruments at the regional and the sub-regional level. And that really, if you like, is problematic because it creates a lot of problems around the selectivity and the limitations and the procedural problems with the way that the UN is set up. But it also, of course, creates more solidarity, but also creates problems, right? So it sets up a lot of regional organizations a little bit in opposition to each other, sometimes grappling for the same resources. So these are the two kind of elements that are both positive and negative, but ultimately this is very, very constructive and constituting for the international order as a whole. It's also kind of, I very much see this moment of PSNR as a legitimacy struggle. And this was a debate that I think went on in some of your earlier seminars and series. And the legitimacy struggle, I think, is very, very important because we tend to think about this as something that's, again, between states or that it emerges only later. But actually what we see here is that there's a legitimacy crusade going on amongst peoples even before they become nation states, around these kind of common problems and around these common challenges. And ultimately that's rooted in the inequity of the liberal international order. And that's important because it shows us that that liberal order is contested almost from the beginning of the UN. It's not just given and rolled out to the Global South. And that's very much a problem with historiography as well, but it's actually quite contested from the 1945 onwards. In another sense, of course, this story shows us that this was an effort very much to kind of narrow the focus of how to achieve self-determination, so to create some kind of structures and substantive and material gains that could be sought through that, but also expanding the scope of how to define it. And that kind of links very much as well with what Milinda was talking about with the indigenous rights claims that come along later. So self-determination just gets wider and wider and wider during these years. And some parts of that become more substantive, but some parts become less substantive. And that's a part of the debate, I think, that deserves further attention. Ultimately, I think what we see is that socialization and the socializing process of the institutional environment, but also of the actors towards that environment, is really an accelerant of normative and political changes. And it institutionalizes and organizes Global South cooperation on a variety of different levels, expands the competency and the agency of the UN in this area, also by really kind of finally lighting a fire under some of those quieter UN departments, such as the Department of Legal Affairs, who get very involved in this discussion and this question. And it goes to a certain extent towards that debate about how the international legal system is shaped by Global South actors also during this period, because they have all these quite substantive debates about the meaning of sovereignty, the meaning of self-determination. And this is just one example of where they managed to wrest their interpretation of that idea onto the international legal order with quite significant and long-lasting effects. So I'll stop there, but thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Alana. That's so interesting, and I think it's just a really interesting way for the three of you to kind of gel in some ways, because when we look at the nature of power and the distribution of power, the struggles that take place, they take place at those kind of rarefied levels of the global, the international, and so on, at this kind of abstract, seemingly abstract, but very real as the way you describe it, working. And I just wonder about the processes from the very deep grassroots, localized, and how those sort of percolate up and respond to structures of power in the nation and then further above. But anyway, that just kind of to kind of unify the local and the global in quite concrete ways. But thank you so much. That was really interesting, actually. And it reminded me of some work by some people on Bretton Woods, for example, 1943, 44, where we often, and be included, have talked about Anglo-American power and so on, but we forget that there were like dozens of other countries involved in those talks. And in a way, we kind of see it, but we don't. And we don't know what it means, and we don't really explore it because you have a concept of who holds power. And what you've shown is the kind of poverty of such an approach, which ignores certain empirical realities and refuses in a way to take them seriously and to investigate them. And when you do, you suddenly discover this rich world, which was sitting there all the time in the same room as you, in just a few different archive boxes away, but you never really asked the question. But anyhow, we've got several questions already lined up, and I think the first one goes to, in a way, to the heart of this idea about knowledge and knowledge production. And here, Atul Shah, a very good friend of mine and a colleague at City, asks specifically about political science. Has political science become far too specialized and uprooted from any kind of grassroots beliefs, communities, and culture? That is to say, is it even fit for purpose for what it is we're trying to uncover in how the world actually works? Why don't we start with Sanaa to have a go at that?
I had an immediate answer for that. I don't think it ever was fit for purpose. I'm saying this half teasingly, but of course, how these systems of knowledge, particularly political science and international relations, has always been somewhat behind the ball on a number of things. And of course, there are many, many scholars. Of course, I say this jokingly because there are also many scholars within the discipline of politics, international relations, and political science who are doing incredibly important and critical work. But I think, broadly speaking, we always have to be able to make a difference and a distinction between our debates within the academy and where real kind of grassroots work and social activism and mobilization takes place. And that's not to say, of course, this is a broader existential question that we as producers of knowledge within the academy may face. And it's definitely an important existential question, but the two are not necessarily exclusive from each other, but the work that takes place within communities where people, and various communities, where people are really committing their lives to kind of not just academizing and theorizing, which is important work if it can be done and reach out to other people as well. But there are gaps that need to be filled within those. And I always find that political science, often it's certainly a field that I've struggled in some cases. And I think that, of course, those of us who are, we're familiar with the fields of the US political academy, which can often be kind of quite exclusionary and especially in terms of journals and publications. But of course, there's been a substantial amount of work that has kind of tried to kind of push the boundaries of our imaginations and ways of thinking, which is shaped by the nature of how university education has changed. But, the very foundations of our university systems and the ways in which we produce knowledge and the very, fact that we have, we're paid for our work. These are jobs, we're remunerated, we are on wages. Some of us have permanent contracts, others have precarious contracts. All of these different factors affect how and what we produce as knowledge. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done there within what we understand as knowledge, within not just political science, but the academy as a whole, and which academies are recognized, or which universities, which institutions, which languages, where are there language gaps? I was teaching in the University of Peshawar, and that's a government university in Pakistan, and the gaps are very visible. And then, so that's one point. And then the second point, of course, is to be able to recognize where academics can be both and can have contributions to what's taking place in politics and on the grassroots. And then also giving space to the political activism, grassroots social mobilization of ordinary people, as well as people who are committed to a world of, of equality and social justice. And not to confuse them, I think sometimes is important, but that's just my take.
Yeah, well, I think the point you make about the origins of political science, I think, Atul, if you read the history of our discipline, I'm afraid it is not a bottom-up movement of the masses of the people. In fact, it's a movement inspired to control the bottom-up movement of the masses of people in order to enumerate them, socialize and control, and feed them into the party system. And I remember reading a long time ago, Walter Lippmann's view, about political scientists. Basically, they were kind of an intellectual priesthood, and they were going to be the specialized experts who would manage this seething mass of democratic demands from people who really didn't know too much about how things worked and really ought to know their place. So it was never really meant to be such a discipline. But I just want to direct something to perhaps to Alana particularly. In my search for speakers for this series and the previous series, what I've come to know, and very refreshingly come to know, is that within the British Academy alone, there is a vast number of scholars who reject the dominant ways of thinking about power, either at the national or the global, and historically as well. Yet there still seems to be this kind of belief that there is a kind of dominant and then there is a kind of less sort of struggling or subordinate set of scholars. And I'm just wondering how, I don't know, do you notice that, or where would you stand in relation to that recognition? Because practically every university in their history department, sociology department, English literature, even international relations nowadays, I don't know about economics yet, but there's decolonizers. There are people who are sort of kind of uncovering the gender biases of our knowledge bases and so on. I just wonder, how do these two discourses sort of carry on at the same time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it reminds me of a question that I got at a conference a couple of years ago that really stuck with me. And somebody, I was presenting some facet of this project, and somebody asked me, why do you say that ideas come down from the UN or go up to the UN, right? So why do we operate with this kind of natural hierarchy of different knowledge producers, if you want to call them that, or different forms of power? And I think it's something to do with the kind of inherent tension between, the way we teach history tends to be very nationally based, as if the state is not just the only actor in most stories, but in fact the determinant of all stories, whether it's to the subaltern peoples within a state, or of what happens at an internationalist fora like the UN. So we only talk about what the states do there, then it's still a state story. And I think there's also a tension between those who may perhaps be rather defenders of the nationalist tradition, of keeping the state as the central unit and keeping kind of classic diplomatic history as the way to think about history. And then what they see as kind of related and sometimes unrelated disciplines of social history, cultural history, internationalist history, and global history, whatever that, and world history, which is something that I've never been able to entirely get my head around that label. And I think there's kind of a tension there. And I think that more and more what we see is that younger scholars or early career researchers tend to push back more against those labels, despite having been traditionally trained perhaps in that school of thought. I can't really speak for why that works in political science, because I'm not familiar enough with political science departments. But what I can see is that it's also a structural problem, right? Because a lot of projects that may be dealing with non-state actors or dealing with even cultural history a lot of the time, they're not in history departments. They're in anthropology and sociology and perhaps even political science departments. And so this also means that they're not considered then as part of the kind of mainstream way of producing knowledge. They're all different elements. And so I think there's a bit of a tension between what this kind of push to be interdisciplinary on the one hand, but not really understanding, in fact, that disciplines are just choices. They're not necessarily determinative for the kind of research that you do. So somehow, to me, the whole conversation about interdisciplinarity, it comes from the wrong tradition. Of course, you engage with other disciplines because you do it naturally, because by going to an archive, you don't just hear the voice of one state, you hear the voice of many different types of people. And that's something that I'm really kind of struggling with a little bit, because one of the big questions that I have for my work, and it's the last thing I'll say to this then, is why did all these people all over the world who were sometimes even without state representation. They believed so much in the power of the UN to kind of shape their destiny. And you know, I'd really like to hear Milinda's answer about this, because you were talking about why Indian internationalism is so global. But there's real, I mean, in the newspaper articles, there's kind of you know, dedicated UN respondents writing columns every week for the general public, and these get published and they get kind of consumed by the general readership of places like Ghana and of course in India and many other states. And I always found that fascinating, that there's this real kind of, it's almost as if the national level is insufficient. Even way before post-colonial states even became independent, they see themselves as peoples, and the UN as peoples, and that connection is very real.
Interesting. Nicely set up, Milinda. Away you go.
Sorry. Yeah, right. Do you want me to intervene, Inderjeet?
Yeah, of course.
Just a very short point about the political science syllabus. Again, a very biographical example. So my parents are both political scientists by training, and my mom's a political scientist. And I remember seeing in the library a copy of Morgenthau when I was growing up. And of course, it was distributed by the USIS agency during the Cold War period, because that's what they wanted people, you know, in Calcutta to read, Morgenthau, rather than all the Marxists that the other Bengalis were reading. So, and Morgenthau, of course, I mean, you know, his whole genealogy from Carl Schmitt and so on is deeply, deeply problematic. So I think there's a very kind of Cold War pedagogy dimension to that as well. How political science was set up in these universities in India, and I'm sure in Africa, in the Middle East, and so on, as really Cold War propaganda as well. And there's a very interesting global history of political science as a discipline in the global South waiting to be written as well. I personally feel more inspired by anthropology, especially the kind of work coming out of indigenous South America, Marisol de la Cadena, Arturo Escobar, Mario Blazer, and so on, and the whole discourse on epistemologies of the South, which has been hugely inspiring for me. And I think anthropologists, you know, are probably doing more to kind of mediate these subaltern voices. But to go to your question, Alana, why do they think so globally? I mean, this was also, of course, my understanding reading my good colleague, friend in Edinburgh, Emma Hunter's work on Tanzania and the Swahili public sphere. I mean, it's so global. And I mean, I would love to know more about Africa, but my sense is, in a way, historians have been asking the wrong questions because they're haunted by the specter of Ranke. I mean, from Ranke onwards, we have been attuned to thinking that history is national history, it's the history of the state. That is what Hegel talks about. But if you look at Ronajit Guho's counter-reply to Hegel, History at the Limit of World History, Ronajit Guho's point is actually most people, you know, in the global South, in India, elsewhere, don't really want to talk about the Weltgeist as manifested to the Volksgeist, the world spirit is manifested to the national spirit. Rather, they have these, I mean, at least that's my reading, people everywhere have this sense of conceptual abstraction, which wants to reach the global, which wants to reach the transborder. And it's only stopped at certain points through what we might call an ontological closure, definitely an epistemic closure by the nation state's hegemony. But actually, if you look at lower caste activists, feminist activists, it's always about the solidarity of all women, the solidarity of all the oppressed, and so on. And that is so fundamental to political intellectual production everywhere in the global South, that to overthrow, and that's why, I mean, to overthrow the smallest regime of power, you have to think globally. And that means also establishing international solidarities. And it is not only about, you know, an instrumentalization of the UN, getting high publicity. I think it goes far more epistemically deeper than that.
To what extent? I've been reading Tim Harper's book, Underground Asia.
Yeah.
It's about 900 pages, so it's taking a while to get through. But one of the things he says, I'm sure he says a lot more, but I'm only up to about page 200 yet, is that, in fact, in a way, subaltern colonized subjects and resistors to imperialism, in a way, discovered the networks of empire and the advantages of those networks to travel before the imperialists themselves perhaps did themselves, such that they were using those kind of the ports, the harbors, the port cities, as places where they worked as sailors and as cooks and people in, you know, kind of smuggling stuff, literature from Japan through Vietnam, through China, through into India and into the Middle East and so on. And I just wonder whether the kind of internationalism to which people look that you've been talking about is reflective of that kind of the traveling that people did, which then brought ideas and peoples together and created hubs in Singapore and, you know, in so many different cities, imperial hubs, but for subversive purposes. So how did that link up, do you think, in the kind of thing that you've been talking about?
I mean, absolutely, I would agree with that. And I mean, to kind of translate this into kind of, let's say, a kind of theoretical subaltern studies perspective, I would say the thing with Hegel. I mean, because one of the things we were talking about is it valid to talk about top and bottom? Right. And I think if you think with Hegel, the phenomenology of spirit, the whole master-slave, the Lord Bondsman dialectic, and the way that Alexandre Kojève interprets it, it's the one who is at bottom who creates the conceptual abstractions about liberty, freedom, etc. Because the one who is at top is not particularly interested in changing the status quo. He is, you know, fine with the world as it is. It's the one who is suffering, who is at the bottom, the subaltern who has to change and therefore create those conceptual abstractions. And I think, and of course, what happens in the process, now thinking with Jean-Hippolyte as well, is that, of course, during the master-slave dialectic, the master realizes his dependence on the subaltern. And that, of course, then makes the power asymmetry kind of change as well. So in concrete terms, absolutely, I think these conceptual abstractions are being produced at the ground level. They're being mediated by the ones Partha Chatterjee calls the subaltern elites. So let's say, you know, looking at Alana's wonderful case, this whole discourse on extractivism, I'm thinking, of course, of this fantastic special issue on decolonization and international law, where Priyasha Saxena talks about how the nation state is territorialized through international law, through control of hydro resources and things like that. But I'm also thinking about, you know, the kind of work that was done in the 1980s by Subrat Rai Chaudhary and Kamil Hussain, you know, their book on this very important edited book on permanent sovereignty over natural resources. Now, of course, the way they are thinking, Kamil Hussain is especially, of course, coming from Eastern Bengal, from Bangladesh, is deeply mediating subaltern discourses. So the ones whose voices we get to hear, and I would say that includes me as well, these subaltern elites having certain class privilege in the Western academy or you know, in the global space, but we have fragmented subjectivities. We are also mediating voices we are hearing, but voices which the Western academy doesn't allow to enter. And these are the kind of voices which in the United Nations as well, by Radha Vinod Pal, by these Ghanaian voices, I'm sure they are, you know, voices elected by, selected by, mediated by subaltern voices, and then they get into the countryside. So we don't directly get to hear the voices from the ports in the United Nations, perhaps from the farms and the fields, but we do get mediations. And that, of course, ties to Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak's immensely important question, can the subaltern speak? And of course, the answer is there's always mediation.
Thank you. Juvaria, did you want to come in on?
Yeah, there's a question in, well, I have more than one question, but one of the questions from the audience I thought was quite interesting about reflecting on your own positionality as a researcher. The other sort of topic which I would like sort of Milinda and Sanaa, if we have time, to maybe discuss a little bit is about, Sanaa used the term performing the border, and then Milinda went on to sort of add to that about how you know, we haven't fully decolonized as long as those borders still exist. And I was wondering if you can sort of comment on that.
Who should go in terms of, I think there's, I mean, I'm going to jump in and take the liberty and go. And I think that it's a really important question. I saw it in the chat, and thank you so much to ask this question on self-reflexivity within the research that all of us do as researchers. And I think it's I don't think scholarship can be done without this question. None of us should be producing work and studying, particularly on such topics of such sensitivity, without those moments of self-reflection. And I think it's crucial and of utmost importance. And, you know, there's always going to be elements of which, whenever I speak about my work, which has primarily been in low-income housing areas or refugee camps in Pakistan, but also in other locations across Europe, as well, there are almost moments where one is always moments that can be triggering because of one's own self-reflections and self-experiences. And then there are all moments where one always has to reflect on the various positions of privilege that we have when we are navigating the fields of which we're working. The privileges that allow us to access certain resources, research sites, to be able to have these very conversations when others will be actually fighting, in the case that I've worked in, certainly just to live. And to be able to access basic resources such as water and the like. And it becomes a real moral imperative as well as an ethical one, and one of how we think about how we produce knowledge. So I think there's a whole host of things that I could say about this. But I think that certainly when one is, engaging in fieldworks that have such sensitivities, the key has always to be able to self-reflect. And I think one has to be able to do that in the work, and to always caveat anything that we do with this kind of moment of an ability to self-reflect, but also depending on the subjects that we're working in, perhaps to also think about the spaces in which we're speaking and who we are speaking to. Perhaps sometimes, for somebody who's worked on the issues of refugees, migration, deportations, some of the conversations that I have are relevant to the academy, but there are a whole host of conversations that are probably not relevant to the academy and are relevant to the peoples and lives of whom I'm working. And I think that's always quite important, as well as the self-reflections of who we are and how we navigate the field impacts and shapes what it is that we see or don't see. I am, for example, somebody who holds dual identity and a nationality and a British passport, which always allows me to leave the field sites with which I work, and I do leave. So I'm always very conscious of making those points aware. But I'd really welcome others as well of bringing in their points as well. And I thank you so much, Milinda, as well, for sharing also in your talk. I really loved the fact that you naturally had the self-reflections in kind of how you shared the details of your work and of the inspirations behind it as well. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sanaa. Just to jump onto that and continue what you were saying, I think I'll just tackle the border question first, because I think border is at the center of empire and of colonialism. And here I mean, border, two things: the border of property and the border of state. And this is something I think I would say, and I'm sure I'm going to be very controversial now, that any state-making project is a colonial project. And that's as much true about ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt and ancient China and the Mauryan state, and of course the Roman Empire, as it is of today. Every state-making project has a colonial sense, because it needs to create these abstractions. My kingdom versus your kingdom, my property versus your property, my people versus your people. And this imperative to create this abstraction, this violence of abstraction. I mean, if you think about the Manu or the Mahabharata, it depicts this phrase as mamedam, this is mine. In Latin, of course, it's the whole distinction of meum and tuum. So I think, and of course, what happens, of course, in the 19th, 20th century is that this form of state making, especially to the Western kind of commodified capitalist framework, gets globalized, and it creates it tears apart communities. If you think about Africa, if you think about indigenous communities in the Americas, I mean, border making is central to their subjugation. So I think decolonization should absolutely be about the overthrow of borders. And frankly, if you look at the writings of Rabindranath Tagore, if you look at the writings of Mahatma Gandhi, you would see that they all knew this. I mean, it was just occluded and marginalized post-1947, but it was at the heart of the anti-colonial project, which then leads me to the next question about subjectivity. Again, I mean, as I was saying with Partha Chatterjee's formulation of subalternity of an elite, I mean, I'm an Indian passport holder, but I'm very conscious of my caste class privileges. And we need to be conscious, of our privileges, not to self-abnegate responsibilities, but to understand how subaltern voices are mediated and what are the voices that get blocked. I mean, I don't want to get too personal now, but of course, I mean, we have all faced situations where our work has not been taken seriously in the Western academy, where we have not been taken seriously. But people in the countryside, in the global South, are in far worse circumstances existentially than us. And the least we can do is to use our responsibility in the classroom, but hopefully also in the wider public sphere, to allow those voices to speak about. And that, of course, also means, in a way, transcending the borders of our own subjectivity. To think our subjectivity itself as a border crossing measure, so that we are not defined by our privilege, our class, and so on, even though we are, of course, inhabiting those situations, but to establish solidarity, and solidarity as a border crossing measure with very deep-rooted political impact, whether it's the vote we cast in the elections, to the marches that we join, to any kind of bigger institutional measures that we can do to change the world. Maybe I'll just quickly, however, I'll quote one sentence from Tagore. Tagore in 1931 was asked what he thought about the League of Nations. And he was talking in London to an international association, and Tagore says, and I'll just read out this quote, "To my mind, it is like a band of robbers being asked to organize the police department." So the reason he was so cynical was because he thought that if you have an international system based on states and their political representatives, basically, and I mean, of course, he's also referring to St. Augustine's City of God, where St. Augustine's asked that without justice, a state is a band of robbers. So he's referencing that as well. But I think the whole border making project, in a way, is allowing states to do what they want with impunity, which is about asking the robbers to run the police department. So, you know.
I think that's a really, can I just jump in, Inderjeet and Juvaria? I think it's a great point, because I also think that, I mean, I think this is, I mean, thank you as well for the reflections on the self and border crossing. And I think as a political kind of like discussion, I think that's crucial and of importance. I also, especially when you're talking about third world internationalism and the idea of kind of crossing borders, and of course, even the moves for self-determination that are so poignant and powerful and moving that we see taking place even across the world today. You know, they are pushing for nation states. And there are, of course, people who are calling within those movements for the limitations of that. And of course, the reasons why we shouldn't also forget the big point is, you know, there's also the radical promise of citizenship within these discussions and within these debates. And the radical promise of citizenship, i.e. of being understood as equal in the eyes of the law and not being equal necessarily for some, through hierarchy of power relations or through a feudal lord or to a cosmological kind of a single god or whatever it may be, is quite a radical promise. And of course, it's what kind of like fuels feminist movements, it fuels anti-colonial movements. It's kind of at the core of kind of many of these movements. But there are certainly, citizenship by its very nature, as bound as it is to the territorial nation state, is exclusionary. And of course, for those who are working with undocumented migrants, with refugees, with people who are in these kind of spaces or stateless persons, citizenship for all of its promise is definitely not the final project. The question of how and when and where we are able to achieve that promise that moves beyond the exclusionary bounds of citizenship is, of course, a huge one, that there are answers that are being provided. But I think that this point of, it's funny to be in a room where we are questioning the very nature of the nation state, because in this field of social sciences and the humanities over the past 10 years or so, there really hasn't been its borders are here. And the discourse that we hear is that borders are here. So even to say that the nation state should be dismantled, which is, I'm really encouraged to hear that the voices are coming out within the academy. It was taboo to say this within the academy. And I think that context should also be remembered, that to say this within the academy within 10 to 15 years ago would have been totally seen as a loon, right? So but these are voices that are being, being articulated much more within and outside the academy as well.
Well, really, I mean, you look at kind of internationalisms and pan movements, Pan-Asianism, Pan-Africanism, and so on. I mean, in a way, there's a whole variety of ideological positions from which internationalisms come. I mean, there are fascist internationalisms too, reactionary internationalism. So in one sense, it suggests the inevitability of going beyond the local to the whole world from a variety of positions and perspectives. So maybe it's not so much that, I mean, I just wonder whether, how we as scholars try to make sense of how the world works, how we kind of navigate through this kind of local, national, international, and try to connect them. One thing I like about this panel, and with Alana coming up at the end with her presentation, is the fact that there are these movements and these trends of thought operating at every level of our lives, of the world. And maybe our scholarship sometimes is kind of subdivided. I look at people who do X at this level, and we look at something else. And I just wonder whether actually there's a kind of dialectics rather than a kind of one set of things going on up here and elsewhere. And I just wonder whether what is required is a kind of global project which actually does interconnect these the local and how it's lived and those sort of thoughts there with the kind of up at the very top level. There are a load of other questions actually on the chat, which some of them I can't even pronounce the terms being used, but I'm afraid we are actually out of time now. But thank you. I want to just say thank you to Alana, and to Milinda, and to Sanaa for their really thought-provoking and deeply felt, kind of emotionally felt presentations as well, and very moving, I think, in their own ways. And I like the biographical elements that you brought in, Milinda. Normally we are very, we don't like to share our private kind of thoughts and so on, but it's very kind of you to do that. But I want to say thank you to our speakers, and thank you to Juvaria, who does fantastic work, largely unseen, to make these things happen every week, and obviously Tanya, who's invisibly invisible, who actually makes it happen. Without her, it wouldn't happen at all. And to our audience as well, which is very patient on a Friday afternoon in London time, in staying with us throughout. So next week we have number 4 webinar, which is on white supremacy and racial capitalism. And we have 4 speakers: Robert Vitalis, Sergian Vucetic, Sophia Edwards, and
Bobby Banerjee.
Oh, Bobby Banerjee. Oh, yeah, one of my own colleagues, Bobby Banerjee, to speak on that big question. So thank you all so much. Have a really nice weekend and so on. Stay safe and stay well, and hope to see you again very soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much.